Hello and welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. Today we have joining us a very accomplished author and a good friend of mine, Carol McGrath. Carol was born in Northern Ireland and fell in love with historical fiction at a young age. While completing a degree in history, she became fascinated by the strong women who were silenced in record and was inspired to start exploring their lives. Her first novel, The Handfasted Wife, was shortlisted for the Romantic Novelists Association Awards, and Mistress Cromwell, which is excellent, was widely praised as a timely feminist retelling of Tudor court life. While she does enjoy doing some Tudor work, Carol has recently been exploring the women of the medieval world, and her latest book, The Lost Queen, is a retelling of the story of Berengaria of Navarre, Richard I's neglected wife. So welcome, Carol.
Thank you.
It's lovely to have you here. We've been looking forward to this one. Firstly, let me ask, what made you want to tell the story of Berengaria of Navarre?
I was discussing what I would write with Elizabeth Chadwick. You know, we text each other, and I was saying that, you know, I've got to think of something to kind of complement Matilda, because Matilda and the Anarchy. And I don't want to do Eleanor of Aquitaine because, well, you've written 3 books on her and other people have written a lot about her, and, I want to do somebody else. And she said, well, you could think about Berengaria. Well, I love the Crusades. And, I thought, well, I'd written about the Crusades with Edward I and his wife. And I sort of thought, well, yes, I've got a bit of background on the Crusades. I'd like to go earlier in the Crusades. And yes, I would really like to write about Berengaria. I knew a little bit about her. And I actually do think that once I got into Berengaria, I did start really feeling for that character. I really liked lots of things about her. And also I like the fact that her story was rarely examined in history. It's not really been examined enough in history and in fiction. So I did know a few interesting tidbits, such as that Richard was, engaged and betrothed to Alice of France, and that wasn't going to go anywhere because, of course, Henry II was notoriously supposed to have had an affair with Alice of France, and of course, Eleanor of Aquitaine was very against any affairs that her husband had. So, I just thought that since Eleanor of Aquitaine encouraged that match, and since Eleanor of Aquitaine, I knew that she had escorted Berengaria through the Alps right down to Sicily, where they married during the early part of the Third Crusade. So I thought, well, that is a very interesting start to a novel, this journey through the Alps in winter with, a young 20-year-old woman with nearly 70-year-old woman, and a formidable woman at that. And I thought, well, yes, that would be very interesting. And particularly as I found out through reading sources that, of course, Philip Augustus didn't know that Richard had betrothed himself to Berengaria. Marriage arranged presumably by Eleanor of Aquitaine. You've got to remember that Aquitaine is on the borders, more or less, of Navarre. There's a little bit of land in between those two. And basically, it was strategic. It was a strategic marriage to some extent to get her father, Sancho, to make sure that his borders in the south were protected from France and Spanish nations, such as Castile. It is also thought, too, that Richard, going right back to earlier in the 80s, in the 1180s, when Henry still was king and Richard was Duke of Aquitaine, it is actually thought that he was meeting up with Sancho, her brother, the younger Sancho, and discussing strategy, protecting his lands against France and mutual interests. And it is thought too that Berengaria could have, as a young girl, around about 15 or 16, even been present at some of those meetings. So it wasn't that she was necessarily a completely unknown person, but it was predominantly probably a strategic marriage. But I found it interesting that Philip Augustus of France did not know that his sister Alice was being set aside in favour of Berengaria. And of course, when he discovered that she was on her way down to Sicily and that there were plans for them to get married, that did not help his relationship with Richard. Because, of course, he and Richard had been great friends in their youth. They had allegedly shared a bed, although it was common, for noblemen to share beds, but whether it was a sexual relationship or not. But he was actually regarded as being an awful character, Philip Augustus. He was pretty loose and easy. But then again, some people say Richard was as well. He was the sort of person who slept with his enemies' wives if he could. But that is all, you don't know that isn't gossip. These sorts of things. There's plenty of gossip nowadays, and there was plenty of gossip then about all sorts of things, and plenty of spin.
Yeah.
But Richard basically jolted Alice to marry Berengaria. So that interested me, and I was very fascinated whenever I delved into her story a bit. I was fascinated by that journey through the Alps. I was fascinated by her relationship with Richard's sister Joanna, which we'll come to in a little bit. And I was absolutely fascinated by the fact that they couldn't marry in Sicily for various reasons. And we get into Lent, which was the main reason that he couldn't marry during Lent. So the marriage was going to be postponed, and they were actually going to marry in Acre. They're going to marry in the Holy Land. However, on the way to the Holy Land, they were in different ships, and it was a huge number of ships, hundreds of ships. And on the way, there was a huge storm, and Berengaria got separated from Richard. Berengaria and another ship of hers were practically shipwrecked off the coast of Cyprus. So Isaac Comnenus, the ruler of Cyprus at the time, invited them to come ashore. But for various reasons and advice from her knights, Berengaria did not go ashore. And of course, they were at the same time searching for Richard's ships. And Richard does appear. And then, of course, Richard does conquer Cyprus. And of course, the wedding is delayed again, but Lent passes, and by May, and she'd arrived in March, so by May they do get married, and they get married in Cyprus. And Isaac Comnenus is allegedly put into silver chains and dropped off on an island fortress between Cyprus and Palestine. But his daughter, whom Isaac Comnenus absolutely adored, apparently, joined Richard's court. Let's say Richard put Berengaria in charge of this beautiful princess whose name is not recorded to history, but a lot about her is, but not her actual name. So I gave her the name Irene in the story. So she became part of Berengaria and Joanna's court. So that interested me as well. And the more I started delving, the more I got interested, and the more I got excited about it. And I got excited about what it was like for her being married to somebody like Richard, who really was very cultured, loved music and so on, but he was a soldier, and he was also, this is the other intriguing thing in the story, he was totally married to his mother. He adored his mother, and his mother had a lot of control over him, and that is historical fact. But it did mean that Berengaria probably felt shut out, and the evidence is that she never was really involved in political decision-making. Not in those early days, certainly, she wasn't. And then I started thinking about things like, what language did they speak, to each other? But then I realised Berengaria spoke Occitan, and Richard spoke Occitan. And they had a lot in common, because Berengaria was educated in a court that respected women. Navarre really respected women. She was trained in political nuances and so on. So it would have made it very difficult for her to be sort of pushed aside a bit by Eleanor. So she was educated, and she would have spoken Latin as well, or at least she would have read Latin, and she would read and she'd write. Although women mostly didn't necessarily write a lot then, they would have had scribes writing for them, but I allowed her to write. So I don't know whether she did, but she certainly could read. And she was supposed to be attractive. Certainly Haydn said that she was very attractive, and And so several of the other sources claimed that she was attractive as well. And I was intrigued too about how she and Joanna, how they existed as two women on the crusade and crusaders' camps. It's always very interesting how women coped. The thing about Berengaria that also intrigued me was that after Richard's death, she never remarried. They had a falling out, it is said, in some of the chronicles before they left the crusade a year and a half later. And the reason they left was famously because Richard was very worried about John forming an alliance with Philip Augustus, who actually had gone back to France by that point. And Eleanor was a bit concerned about it and sent letters to Richard. So Richard was very aware of what was going on. And of course, the person whom Richard had left in charge of England at that time was not popular with a lot of the nobles. And as a result of that, John did have some support. And so that is one of the reasons why Richard abandoned the crusade. The other reason was that he wasn't getting enough support. He didn't have enough military support. It is thought that he could have taken Jerusalem, but he couldn't have held Jerusalem. One of the main things I really liked about Berengaria was that she was a survivor. She outlived Richard by many, many decades, and she lived into Henry III's reign. And I like that about her, that she was a survivor and she never remarried. And she was actually quite loyal to Richard, which is intriguing in itself, considering that they didn't spend enough time together.
No, I love that she was a survivor and that she had her own career after Richard.
The Lady of Le Mans.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so Berengaria is, if not the least known of English queens, certainly one of the least known. So how difficult was it to research her story?
Well, it was difficult, without doubt. I knew a lot about Richard. I knew a lot about Eleanor. I knew a little bit about Berengaria, and I was intrigued by her. My first port of call was a book called In Search of Richard the Lionheart's Queen by Anne Trindle. I don't know if you know that one, Sharon, but that is a very, very good book. And Anne Trindle explores how they may have met. She explores Richard's motivation for the marriage. Could they fall in love? Did he fall in love with her in his youth? Berengaria is first mentioned in the Chronicles in the spring of 1191, when she and Eleanor crossed the Alps. The other question was, if Berengaria was barren, why did Richard not repudiate her? What was the role of Eleanor in this marriage? So Roger of Howden wrote a contemporary account of Richard's life. Richard Devizes wrote a contemporary account of Richard's life. And of course, there is the Richard of folklore and stage. But it's very hard to find Berengaria. Studies of medieval queenship can help, but Berengaria never set foot in England, which was interesting. But she had been at one point, whenever they reconciled in 1196, after Richard was very sorry for all the sins that he'd committed, and he was told, you should spend more time with your wife by bishops. Well, he did start to spend more time with her, but then his campaigning got in the way. Then I had to, as I said earlier, explore the languages that they may have spoken, such as Aquitaine and Latin to each other, probably Aquitaine. She probably did learn French, some French, because medieval French was spoken widely at the English court.
Yeah.
There would have been French speakers in Navarre, and there would have been a lot of those with ecclesiastical backgrounds passing through Navarre and in Navarre as well. That book by Anne Trindle was very significant, and of course that led me to looking at Howden and various other primary sources in the Bodleian, which I can use. But the one that I really loved was Ambrose's History of the War. Ambrose's History of the War is fantastically written, and there's a really good translation of it by Marianne Isles. And I think it's my favourite of those primary sources that I did access. It has an excellent description of their marriage in Cyprus, right down to the clothes that they wore, which I've actually used in the novel. Ambrose was there, so I don't see any reason not to believe what he says. There are lots of details in Ambrose about when Richard was ill, and then you have to wonder, how did Berengaria respond to this, and how did this affect their relationship? And because he was ill at Acre, he was carried to the walls of Acre on a stretcher, basically, because he insisted on leading the campaign forward. And at that point, Philip of France had abandoned the campaign and left the Duke of Burgundy in charge of it. in charge of the French contingent. Okay, so he takes Acre, and I found out all the details of that from Ambrose and various other sources. And there's one thing that he did in Acre that was absolutely horrific. He was responsible for a massacre outside the walls of Acre of Turkish knights who'd been in Acre. Richard did take Acre, and then a deal was being made with Saladin, and Richard broke it. But it is also thought that Saladin was delaying with this deal. And basically what Richard did was he marched the inhabitants, men, women and children, outside the walls, and they were killed, thousands of them. And Berengaria and Joanna would have seen that. So I find, by looking at what Ambrose had written and other people, then I've got to translate that. How would Berengaria feel about that? How would Joanna feel about that? And I've also got to divorce myself from being a modern woman living in the 21st century and try and see it from the times that existed then. You've got to think about the fact that Berengaria and Joanna both did come from places where there was a lot of intermingling between the Arab worlds and the Jewish worlds and the Christian worlds. For example, Jews were respected for commerce within Navarre. The Arabs were respected, the Muslims were respected for their culture and their design and their architecture and all of that kind of thing. You see those influences throughout Spain. So they were mixing. So I imagine that there would have been more empathy in those two for people from the Arab world than there might have been from other Christian queens who had not experienced the Arab world in the way they had. So I find that very interesting, because then I've got to translate these sources into how they were seeing these events and how they felt about these events, especially something as horrific as a massacre. And I hope I dealt with that okay in the book.
No, I thought you did. I thought you handled it very well. It was one of the things I was wondering.
That was hard. To get a balance was difficult, and I'm not sure I really completely got that balance. I also used primary Arab sources in translation. Ambrose was a treasure trove of detail, and I loved his descriptions of the Saracen fighting, for example, how they used the metal spears, and he says they seemed to fly like swallows.
Yeah.
I thought it was lovely at the touch. And he's the one who mentions a lot about the troubadours, and I did read some books about Blondel as well. There's one very, very good about Blondel, book about Blondel, which I think you know about, Sharon. I think you mentioned that one, Blondel's song. The troubadour culture, she would have been very familiar with, Berengaria. So I looked into the troubadour culture as well. And I looked into the storytelling culture in Navarre as well, actually, when I was writing that book. I knew that she was a bit of a blue stocking. I knew that she was very keen on music. And those were points of, reference that both she and Richard would have had. They're both very cultured. But then many queens, of course, would have been. I just found it very interesting looking at the troubadour stories and also the stories of Navarre. I found in Ambrose that he mentioned that she was called in song the Frozen Heart. And I think that came up in Blondel's story as well. They called her the Frozen Heart because she was quite aloof. That was another aspect of her that I thought was interesting. And then there were other things like Haydn referred to Berengaria and Joanna like birds in a cage. So this is what it was like for, these royal women who were on the Crusades. They were very protected and guarded and so on and so forth. Another source are paintings and pictures and all of that kind of thing. And one picture that I really loved was that of her effigy, because her effigy had lovely features, like her long. I think these effigies were so varied so much that they must have been a little bit like. She had long flowing hair, and she lived till she was 60 years. And there was a lion at her feet, and the faithfulness, and a little dog, and she holds a book. I mean, there were things that gave a clue to her personality. So that was another form of research, was looking at her effigy in the cathedral that she founded. So yes, there was a lot of research went into that book. It was a hard book to write. It might not have seemed that, but it was a very difficult book to write, because you gather all this research, you gather all this knowledge, but you want to translate it into a story with characters that you love. And in fact, Ian Ross, is it?
Yeah.
The novelist. Yeah. Ian Ross read it, and he gave my editor a lovely comment for it, that he felt that Adeliza and William, he loved their story because he felt that they represented the novel's beating heart. And in a way, I think there's some truth in that, because I could be so free with them.
I can see that. They also had a romance that Berengaria didn't get with Richard.
Yes, that's right. It was kind of very difficult for her to have that romance with Richard. I couldn't do that because it wasn't there, I don't think.
No.
I think he admired her and I think he respected her, but I think he definitely respected her. But I don't think there was that romance there.
He was in love with war.
He loved his wars.
So I love the friendship between Richard's sister, Joanna, and Berengaria. And it's one of the things I've looked at frequently, especially when I was writing about Joanna. I've never actually done much research on Berengaria, so I've only looked at it from Joanna's view. But were they really that close?
Well, I think they did become close companions. Of course, I'm going to hype that up a little bit for a story, aren't I? But, they were together a lot and they did have points of reference in their backgrounds. That doesn't mean to say they necessarily could have liked each other, but they were together after. Whenever they left the Holy Land, they were together. They sailed to Rome, where they were supposed to meet up with Richard. They didn't because, of course, things happened to Richard, and it was a long time before they saw Richard again. Because Richard was taken into Germany as a hostage. That's a whole story in itself, and everybody knows about that. So I'm not really giving anything away there. She and Joanna then were together then, and they were together when they were able to leave Rome and travel on. Of course, they couldn't travel during the winter and the seas to Marseille because of for the same reason that Richard couldn't. They left it all too late. And they didn't want to be swept out into the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar, for sure. But very difficult to get up to Marseille. And so they had to wait. And eventually they do sail to Marseille, where he was then too. And I don't think they want to do that again. So they announced they were waiting to see what would happen about Richard. So they waited in Rome. And eventually they travel on. And Joanna does travel on with Berengaria. And Joanna's with Berengaria were there in Poitiers. And was with her for quite a long time, and she went to her mother then, I think, quite a bit as well. And then there was the marriage that was made for her with Raymond, which I can't imagine Berengaria really approved of, because I don't think Berengaria was too keen on Raymond as a person, possibly.
I don't think anyone was keen on Raymond.
So they seem to have been close companions until that point where Richard makes the marriage for her with Raymond, and that's a strategic marriage as well. I think at first that possibly, I don't know, you probably know more about it than I do, but that was possibly a good marriage at first, but not necessarily ultimately a successful marriage.
No, it was successful in that they did produce an heir.
Yes.
But their own relationship seems to have been quite dodgy towards the end.
I think so too.
She technically left him.
They were also very individual women in the context of the chivalric culture, courtly influences. They both understood that. And I think that they're both very, very interesting. And I think that there's more to them than just viewing them through the lens that contains the prejudices and fears of the medieval church, which is often misogynistic. I felt that they were very strong women in their own rights.
I do like the idea that they seem to have developed a friendship, because they were basically forced together from Sicily onwards, Joanna and Berengaria.
Yes, they were. And Joanna, one of the reasons that she went with Richard on the crusade was because she'd actually taken a vow to crusade, apparently. And so she was quite happy to join her brother on the crusade. And that was very convenient because Eleanor was going back to sort out things in England and she wasn't keen to go to the crusade again. So it was convenient for her daughter to continue as a companion for Berengaria until they were able to marry, and afterwards, obviously, on the crusade.
So how common was it for women to go on the crusade? Was that unusual, or was it, typical?
Well, no, there were an awful lot of women on crusades. In fact, Richard got to a point where he banned any woman going down on his march down the coast towards Ascalon, intending to strike inland to Jerusalem. The only women he would allow to join them would be washerwomen or older women who were pilgrims, religious women. And there were some there. But the evidence from medieval Europe and the Middle East during the period of the Crusades does reveal that women played a large part in those wars. And there are some books written about that as well. But women were regarded as either being perfect wives, pious martyrs, evil Jezebels. And so women's involvement in sources is depicted very often as being exceptional. Was it, though? because it actually was quite wide-reaching and quite normal. It was often positive. Albert of Aiken wrote, for example, in his history of the First Crusade, that in a famine in the siege camp, he writes of fornication, sin, adultery. Now, this is what the churchmen presumably thought was going on, and to some extent was. And women were expelled from that camp where there was all this going on. And that was just one group of women and just one opinion. But there were women present in the armies of the First Crusade, apparently. They didn't formally take the cross. They accompanied the Crusaders as servants and companions. And they were often taken prisoner because, they would be in the armies out of desperation. The men needed the help. So sometimes they actually shaved their hair off or cut their hair and posed as men. That has been recorded as well. So basically they wouldn't generally be in armies. Don't get that impression, but they would play a combat role in emergencies, and it would have been a support role, generally speaking, which would be herding livestock to safety, loading crossbows, and providing the boiling water that they were using against the enemy, and preparing munitions and labouring tasks and laundresses and that kind of thing. And the same applies to the Third Crusade. So although there's more written about women in the First Crusade, apparently, than there is about the women in the Third Crusade, Richard only allowed washerwomen and pilgrims on his march. Royal women also very often initiated and organised campaigns. Now, though I'm talking about the royal women, perhaps who were the royal women of Jerusalem as a result of and during the Second Crusade, the sort of thing that we've seen in that very famous film,
Kingdom of Heaven.
Yeah. One of my favourite movies.
Yeah,
mine too. Actually, I love it. It's one of those films which, if it comes on and I didn't realise it was coming on, I just have to carry on watching it.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I think it's time for
I
me
was
to
just
watch
thinking
that
that I might watch that tonight.
But those are the sort of women I'm talking about, who would have organised the campaigns, but they didn't really get involved in the fighting except in emergencies. But, there are stories of some did. They provided diplomatic support. For example, Berengaria did an awful lot of diplomatic support in Rome for Richard, who was trapped on his way back. Of course, their monthly bleeding did render them spiritually impure in the eyes of the clergy.
I think it's actually quite telling that there are so many. Everybody can name that Eleanor of Aquitaine went on crusade because it was such a scandalous deal at the end of it. But there's Eleanor of Aquitaine, there's Margaret of Provence, Berengaria of Navarre, Joanna, who was Queen of Sicily, Eleanor of Castile. That's 5-6 queens who went on crusades.
Yes, never mind those who were in our dreamer. So there were quite a lot of noble families, noble women, marriages. But there are stories, and there's a lovely story, but it's thought that this might not really be true. But there is this lovely story about the woman who set out with her goose on the First Crusade, and the goose led her, and she followed it.
Oh, yes.
A bit like the children's crusaders following their Pied Piper type person. But some crusade chronicles do invent women crusaders to improve their narratives. Just like I might fill in a few little spaces with a bit of exaggeration at times. Florina, for example, the daughter of Hugh of Burgundy, was said to have died in battle in late autumn 1097. She hoped to marry Svend, the son of the King of Denmark, if the expedition was successful. But the army was attacked by the Turks whilst crossing the Kingdom of Rome, which is part of Turkey, and both were killed. However, the dates don't work. And she would have only been 14 years old, and she's not mentioned in any charters by her father, Otto I. So she was likely an invention. And the reason for the invention was a moral warning to women of the dangers of going on crusade. To go on crusade was a penitential exercise, and women were involved in that exercise as well. They went through, there were nuns and so on, as I write in the book, they did set up convents and so on. And then there were business motives too. The Outremer area was very lucrative for sole traders, so female traders, widows, and so on, especially from places like Genoa. So you had, you had that too. Okay, that brings us to another question that I think is really great.
Yeah, this is one of the things. It's barely believable, and yet it really did happen. Richard offered his sister Joanna to Saladin's brother as a wife, And that actually happened, didn't it?
It absolutely did happen, 100%. And I've read it in some primary sources as well. And I've read about it in the Arab translation. The story of Richard's proposal for his sister to wed Saladin's brother is in contemporary Muslim accounts. That's fact. And they say that Richard, this is what the Arab sources say, they say that Richard used the possibility of marriage as a bargaining tool. And the condition was that Al-Adil, Saladin's brother, should become a Christian. Now, he was in favour of the marriage, but of course, Joanna famously refused. This is where I go back to Sicily. Now, interfaith marriages only took place, however, in Sicily between the peasant rural population, not the nobility. However, in the Middle East, there were marriages between Muslims and non-Latin Christian families, and they were commonplace, and they didn't necessarily require the spouses to convert, because two of Al-Adil's sons contracted such marriages. So it was a way of making alliances. So as for Joanna and Al-Adil, if they'd married, they would have shared authority over Jerusalem and the castles of the kingdom. We cannot know if Richard's proposal was serious, because his suggestion put his opponents at disadvantage, because they had to guess what his motives were. So it bought him valuable time. We do know that. And we do know that there was no doubt about it, Joanna was going to refuse. However, it would have solved a lot of problems. And given that there were these intermarriages, and given that Adil would have agreed to convert, and it would have solved that whole problem of saving Jerusalem for the Christians, especially if he converted to Christianity. So it is a kind of open thing, and it was very, very interesting. That was a very interesting story to handle as a novelist. You can see the dramatic possibilities of that. I absolutely loved handling that story. However, he must have known Joanna would never agree, and he must have known that the church would have been very anti it.
Yeah.
So what about Richard and Berengaria? I mean, how much, obviously, when you're writing a novel, you have to say something. You can't just say, "Oh, we don't know that." So how much do we actually know about their relationship? You've hinted that we don't know very much, but is that the case?
Well, the case is that we don't know factually very much, and they didn't have children. So we do know that there may be other reasons for that Richard was a campaigner, and it was circumstances as well. He'd gone on this crusade. He'd promised to go on this crusade. It was not possible. For one of the big disappointments in his life was that he couldn't actually get to Jerusalem. He did intend to come back. All his life, he'd been a campaigner. Richard did have a child, as you must know, by a woman in France, and that child is recorded as having married well, a boy, and he recognized that boy. We do know that she was very loyal to Richard. That's evidenced by her tomb. Richard's sexual preference comes into this as well, because that's very elusive. There's no evidence that he was exclusively homosexual. It's Haydn who gave that report about him sharing a bed with Philippe of France when he was younger. But the culture then was different. So we don't know. And we do know that he did have relations with women. The problem was that Richard was always on the move. So it's a difficult marriage in that they were not able to be together enough in the Holy Land or in Aquitaine or in Normandy. It's difficult with Berengaria and the relationship because she's always overshadowed by her dramatic husband. And you have to really read between the lines, because of the crusade and the wars with Philip Augustus following the crusade, because of his imprisonment in Germany and Austria. So there's a lot of drama there, and because of Blondel, who really did exist. But what kind of relationship was that? I'm not sure that was a sexual relationship at all, but who knows? He never set her aside, despite their lack of children. And we cannot know if Richard ever fell in love with Berengaria. That we cannot know. But we do know that the Cypriot princess accompanied Berengaria to the crusade and was very alluring. That is mentioned in chronicles. And we do know that there was tension between Berengaria and Richard before they left Acre. But then, life got in the way. Richard didn't make it to Rome. Roger of Howden mentions, of course, that they may have met when the kings of Navarre and Castile visited Henry II around about 1183, and there was a preoccupation with the borders and that sort of thing. And it is a fact that Richard spent time on his southern borders. It's not impossible that they met at all. And Richard, of course, as I said, did father a son prior to his marriage, a boy named Philip, interestingly. So much good stuff in this story, In 1195, after his marital reconciliation with Berengaria, Richard did become a regular churchgoer. He turned a new leaf, and they planned to, in that reconciliation, they planned to build, they never really had a home together. So he actually romantically suggested, and this is true, that they buy this land and that Berengaria oversees the building of a house that is their retreat, to be their retreat. I presume so that they could actually, hopefully, conceive children. It's very romantic. So I get the feeling he is quite romantic. Roger of Howden tells us of Richard's penance, his confessions and his communions and his reconciliation with Berengaria. And I still think that the estrangement could have been something to do with the Cypriot princess, because she's mentioned, but we never get her name. This is the thing. And here's an interesting thing about her. This is a little aside. She traveled with Joanna. She kept with Joanna. She was with Joanna whenever Joanna was with Raymond. And when Joanna died, Raymond married the Cypriot princess. And she left him. And she had the marriage dissolved, and she went back to the Holy Land, and she married a more humble knight from the north.
Sounds like she's worth a book.
She really is, but we don't even know her name. I'm sure Richard liked beautiful women. Berengaria was beautiful, fair of form, wise, intelligent, and, definitely a queen consort. And there's no evidence that she was supplanted by any other woman except possibly possibly for a period, but she was not actually supplanted by a permanent mistress. And in fact, the Cypriot princess traveled with Berengaria and Joanna. She wasn't in Richard's ships or anything on the way back. The problem is Berengaria could not be a normal noble wife because of circumstances. She had no real home, and when they had that retreat at Thoré, no sooner did she have that built than Richard's off in the wars again. At the same time, she was excluded from councils, but she was left in charge of Poitiers at a point after the reconciliation. She was left in charge of Aquitaine. But her queenship is ill documented, and a queen without a male heir is always at risk. The reunion in 1196 was sadly replete with hope deferred. So the answer is she's a lost queen.
She is. So we've talked about Berengaria. Well, I've got to ask, what did you think of Richard the Lionheart?
Oh, whoa. Yes, I first encountered Richard the Lionheart in Robin Hood and His Merry Men, and then again, and when I was studying Walter Scott and read Ivanhoe.
Yeah.
Therefore, I came to Richard with a kind of romantic opinion, so to speak. I like him. He was adventurous, intelligent, a strategist. I think that he was quite religious, which is at heart, which is evidenced by his penance in 1196, but probably conflicted, probably tried to be better than he could be in that respect, because he was a warlord. I think he was basically very honourable. In general, he was honourable. And he was respected by Saladin. That is fact. He was very respected by Saladin. But then again, they both played a game with each other a lot of the time. Berengaria was loyal to him, and that does say something. She was unfortunate that they didn't spend enough time together, and it was unfortunate too that he was wed to his mother psychologically. But equally, he clearly respected intelligent women, and that's what his relationship with his mother does actually prove. He did respect intelligent women. He was musical, and he was cultured, and he was interesting. But there is one thing that maybe I'm bringing my modern sensibilities to it, but I cannot forgive what he did at Acre, the massacre at Acre. That's the one blot on the landscape of Richard I for me, really.
Yeah, same here. Although at least you can understand it in a way. He was marching on. He couldn't take the prisoners with him.
No.
And he didn't want to leave them at his back.
No, he didn't.
So he was sort of out of options.
Yes, he was out of options. I don't think he did that lightly.
No.
I think that Saladin was taking his time about bringing his prisoners, the Christian prisoners. But I like Richard. I think on the balance, I'm intrigued by him. I found him interesting. But I think it's very interesting looking at trying to get a grip on the psychology of some of these personalities.
Okay, so are you able to tell us what you're working on at the moment?
Well, I said I would tell you about what I was working at the moment, and it's not a secret because I've signed the contract now, and I'm doing a sequel to The Woman in the Shadows, renamed Mistress Cromwell. I'm doing it through Elizabeth Seymour's eyes because she married Gregory, Cromwell's son. And so the first part of that book is Elizabeth was married very young, interestingly, because when you think about it, Jane never married until she was 29. And there's lots of stories about why that could have been. But Elizabeth married the governor of Jersey very young, and she had a child when she was 15, and she was pregnant whenever he died with her second child. So she was 17 when, instead of going to Wolf Hall back to her father, or instead of going back to court, because she had been a maiden of Anne Boleyn's and probably was at court various times during that first marriage, she took up residence in her dower territory, which is Kexby. Do you know of Kexby in Yorkshire?
No, whereabouts in Yorkshire is that?
I had a great trouble researching some of this and actually finding Kexby, would you believe? It's only about, if you were riding, it would only be about an hour's journey or 2 hours journey from York. So it's not very far from York, and it's east. It's between, say, York and Hull, going that direction. And then, of course, I had to find Wilberforce Abbey because a lot happens in Kexby, and I was able to make up a lot for that. But when she was going south to her brother's house in London, Edward's house in London, and a marriage was made for her with Gregory Cromwell, she did leave her daughter, Marjorie, at Wilberforce. And I puzzled at that. You know, a little girl of 2 years old, turning 3, being left at Wilberforce, but she was left there, and I eventually found where Wilberforce was. It was very, very near Kexby, very close to Kexby, and just a little bit further east, but, you know, an hour would take you to Wilberforce easily riding. So that's what I'm writing, and I will be looking at the downfall of Cromwell through her eyes, because all sorts of things happen. I mean, Gregory is very close to his father, and Gregory worked for his father, and Gregory was in the party that brought Anne of Cleves over, and, you know, Gregory is another lens into it. But when Cromwell died, these are the questions you ask yourself. When Cromwell was executed, all his lands were taken, all his houses and so on were taken, and for a while they had to live hand to mouth, Gregory and Elizabeth, with friends and that kind of thing. That was resolved within 6 months, because Henry VIII always regretted executing Cromwell, and Cromwell had asked not to treat his family badly. So the thrust of the story is looking at the fall of Cromwell through her eyes, and also her relationship with Gregory. There are a couple of interesting things about Gregory. For example, Cromwell had given them Lewes Priory to live in, and he had to move them very, very quickly from Lewes because Gregory fell foul of the church. He was supposed to do penance, and he refused to do penance. So you get the impression, now, what was that over? What was he doing penance over? We don't know. And I know that Elizabeth went to stay with friends during that period. She didn't stay on in the Priory in Lewes until Cromwell moved them to
Leeds?
Yes, Leeds Castle.
And would Elizabeth and Jane have known each other if Elizabeth had been so young when she was married?
Well, they did. I mean, they did know each other, but they were both at court. She was at court when she was a young teenager. She married when she was about 14. So, yes, and they would have been back at Wolf Hall, back and forwards. But Jane was 10 years older than Elizabeth. So that's one book. And then the other book that I've contracted for is Margaret Douglas. Meg Douglas, who was Henry VIII's niece. The thrust of that story is really her relationship with Thomas Howard, half-brother of the Thomas Norfolk. They had a clandestine, some people say a clandestine marriage, but it was really a clandestine engagement for contract.
Right.
What happened to that relationship and that romance is intriguing, because they were under sentence of death, basically. Henry never intended to execute Margaret Douglas, but when you think about it, when Anne Boleyn was executed, Elizabeth was out of the picture. Mary was out of the picture as being in succession, because he divorced Anne Boleyn before he executed her, and the marriage was annulled. And so who was next in line to the throne? Well, there was, of course, Henry Fitzroy, possibly.
Oh, he died a couple of months later, didn't he?
But he died a couple of months later. So who does that leave? Meg Douglas. When Henry VIII finds out about Meg Douglas and Howard, he is absolutely furious. And so, you know, she's the heir to the throne for a while.
That is an intriguing book.
So it's a good story. I mean, there's a lot more about her. I mean, she does have a second marriage, and she does become the mother-in-law to Mary Queen of Scots, her son's Darnley. There's a lot of interesting stuff about her. There's really 2 books worth with her. Absolutely 2 books worth with her. So those are the 2 books I'm working on at the moment, and I've got a year to write each of them. That's why I can't write any non-fiction, because it takes me so long to write fiction, Sharon.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Carol.
Thanks very much for having me, and it's just been lovely just to chat.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and I know everybody's going to really enjoy The Lost Queen, because I did.
I'm so glad that you enjoyed The Lost Queen. I really enjoyed writing it, but it was hard to write.
It's easy to read.
Yeah.
It's easy to read.
Hopefully.
Thanks ever so much.
Thanks very much, Carol. It's been lovely.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So thank you very much to Carol McGrath. Do look out for her latest book, The Lost Queen, which is out in July. Join us next time when we will be going rogue and into the Reformation period with Margaret Ski to discuss Catherine von Bora, the wife of Martin Luther. Thanks very much for listening. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thank you very much for listening today. And if you enjoyed our podcast, why not subscribe to ensure you don't miss the next one? Goodbye.